Hello everyone, and welcome to the online event series Grassroots, Artmaking and Political Struggle. We are Amy Tobin and Catherine Spencer, and we have been working together to organise this event over the past year. Grassroots comprises 3 afternoons of papers and discussion in April, May and June 2021. And although we are unable to have these discussions in person, we hope that by gathering resources, including the recordings of papers on the project's webpage within the Kettle's Yard website, we will be able to share ideas and research beyond the parameters of the event series itself. We are pre-recording this introduction so that audience members and speakers can listen to it in advance of any of the 3 sessions, as it serves as a point of introduction for the series as a whole.
Over the course of this online event series, we hope to trace interactions between art and politics in Britain during the 1960s, 70s and 1980s, while also reflecting on the legacies of the works, relationships and organisational infrastructures created during this period in the present. We've been motivated by 2 things.
So first, by a desire to map the intersections of grassroots organising and art practice across different political struggles. While narrating independent political struggles and the formation of particular political identities are fundamental to understanding this period, there were also considerable interactions, intersections and parallel strategies that require attention. Furthermore, bringing diverse struggles together also allows us to think through difference as well as similarity. Ultimately, we seek to challenge the descriptor identity politics, which homogenizes and reduces political art practices in this period.
Secondly, we're keen to rethink the possible relationships between art and politics more broadly. How do the organisational structures and networks of grassroots organising demand different art forms, alternative means of dissemination, and other structures of value? It's not our intention to make these practices legible for institutionalization and commodification, but to offer space to think historically about the ways and means of being political and creative. Our speakers, in different but complementary ways, continue to develop new methodologies for thinking about the relationship between art making and political struggle, ensuring that contextualization does not overshadow the specificities of artworks and forms of expression, particularly those that take a deliberately counter-hegemonic stance.
In an in-depth analysis of Eddie Chambers's The Destruction of the National Front from 1979 to 1980, one of the works that we've had in mind while preparing this series, Sonia Boyce offers a powerful and nuanced reflection on these questions, which helps us begin to orient the parameters of our project. In her reading of Chambers's work, Boyce pushes against the biographical and sociological accounts that, as Tobin and Mercer noted in his contribution to the landmark collection Shades of Black, Assembling Black Artists in 1980s Britain from 2005, which grew out of a conference at Duke University in 2001, have come in particular to dominate readings of works by artists associated with what has come to be known as the British Black Arts movement.
Boyce carefully balances attention to the context in which this work was made, notably the rise in both racialised immigration rhetoric and law under the new Conservative government led by Margaret Thatcher, and the interlinked increase in racist violence in the streets by white supremacist groups like the National Front. At the same time, Boyce scrutinises the specific material qualities of the work, notably its use of collage, through which the sections of red, white and blue paper that make up the Union Jack swastika hybrid become increasingly fractured and fragmented, torn finally into confetti-like fragments, which could be easily dispersed with only the slightest puff of breath.
Boyce eloquently frames the opening of her investigation into destruction of the National Front in conjunction with Rashida Reen's For Oluwale of 1971 to 73 and also 1975. She writes, quote, "I am in a quandary, unable to reconcile a dilemma. The source of my problem comes from a desire to uncouple and deprivilege a socio-political reading of artworks by Black British artists in favour of drawing our attention to the aesthetic form and strategies that the work of art offers. However, and here is the dilemma, There is a conjunction of social and political commentary within certain modernist strategies that sits at the heart of many works of art from the 1970s into the 1980s. So as Boyce articulates, it is not necessarily a case of either or, but of nuancing understandings of what art and politics might comprise, as well as understandings of the imbrications of content with form historically. Boyce entreats us to think about the range of references and the relations that artists may have with historical practices, productive as well as critical. Artists of colour have access, Boyce argues, to the full range of art historical resources that may signify or be re-signified in different ways, opening up resonances as well as highlighting disjuncture.
We can think about the act of physical dismantling involved in destruction of the National Front, the manual tearing and suturing of collage fragments as simultaneously channeling the spirit of Dada experiments, but also as analogous to the efforts of grassroots activism to propose alternatives to existing structures. There is not only a direct parallel between Chambers' work and the grassroots activism against the National Front led by Black and South Asian organisers, but also a connection to be made between the structure of the work and a self-consciously deconstructive mode of political engagement that deliberately seeks to remake the socio-political consensus through actions which might not always be immediately legible and large scale, but which coalesce over time into a fundamental revisioning of the status quo, a sentiment shared with many Dada artists.
In their biography of Darcus Howe, who played a crucial role in the civil rights and Black Power movements in Britain, Robin Bunce and Paul Field point to the crucial role that grassroots activism played in Howe's approach to organising, notably during the trial of the Mangrove 9. They point to the influence of his transnational experience in both the United States and Trinidad. And they cite a 1973 statement by Howe, which is highly relevant for the parameters of this series. And this is Howe. You have to organize yourself politically. You have to say, my power is not only the power to defend myself in court, but the power of the population to defend itself by taking a collective action against the power structure of this country. And so it boils down to this, in my view, that in order to deal with the situation with the police, one would have to unite the experience of brutality not only with the police, but brutality in housing, brutality in education, brutality in all areas of our social lives. Unite those experiences in ourselves, and that unity must be reflected in our organisation. Organise ourselves politically, because this government is not going to take up its responsibility unless it sees people on the street.
Howe's statement describes the highly relational and interconnected elements of grassroots organising, which must contend with violence in all its forms. Although these words refer to the specific struggles of Black communities in Britain during the 1970s and 1980s, they are instructive for all liberation movements and speak to the need for coalitional practices that challenge the ways in which capitalism recruits and enforces the control structures of gender, race, ableism, class, and sexuality. Art world institutions were another site of brutality, from their exclusionary to denigratory policies to the shoring up of particular ideas of quality and taste. And as such, they were another site of protest and resistance, while grassroots organising also provided a means to realise alternative spaces and places in which other ideas, affects, meanings, and feelings around art making could be explored and manifested.
These structures, formal and informal, included the curation and circulation of exhibitions, the establishment of spaces, studios, unions, working groups, the writing of essays, statements, manifestos, and catalogues. While artworks of artists active in this moment may be the subject of recuperation by the contemporary art world, the infrastructures and the discourses that surrounded their practice, and sometimes maybe even distracted them from their practices in the 1970s and 1980s, are often ignored or distorted. What methodologies do we need to take account of these activities, whilst also telling the stories of individual artists and artworks? How might we, to return to the example of destruction of the National Front, understand this work as fundamentally connected to, but not circumscribed or overwritten by, the extensive networking, organising and administration that Chambers did in the Midlands, whilst still a student at Sunderland Polytechnic, as a member of the Pan-African Connection and later the Black Art Group, including helping to arrange the first National Black Art Convention in 1982, alongside artists including Keith Piper, Claudette Johnson and Marlene Smith, among others. We hope to continue to think these questions through during the 3 days of online discussion.
Grassroots Artmaking and Political Struggle builds on the range of recent scholarship on art practice in Britain, which has drawn in turn on a number of crucial theoretical interventions, artist publications, curatorial statements, and groundbreaking essay collections, survey texts, and articles over the years. In particular, we take note of work that seeks to trouble the limitations and constrictions of nationalist formations, including diaspora thinking, Black Atlanticism, the impact of decolonization in the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, as well as studies of British colonialism in Ireland.
We have drawn on a range of scholarship, exhibition making, art practice, and publications, including most recently Fiona Anderson and Glyn Davis's Cruising the 70s events and special issue of Third Text, which was only very recently published. Nick Aitkins and Elizabeth Robles' edited book, The Places Here, The Work of Black Artists in 1980s Britain, from 2019, which brought together a huge amount of scholarship relating to a longer series of exhibitions and events. Greg Salter's Art and Masculinity in Post-War Britain, Reconstructing Home from 2020, Leon Wainwright's Phenomenal Difference, A Philosophy of Black British Art from 2017, Okri and Weasel's Mappa Mundi catalogue, an exhibition on Frank Bowling's work in 2017, Alexandra Coccoli's The Feminist Uncanny in Theory and Art Practice from 2016, Shona Wilson's Art, Labour, Sex Politics, Feminist Effects in 1970s British Art and Performance from 2015, X Marks the Spot's Guide to the Women's Artist Slide Library, now housed at Goldsmiths, and Eddie Chambers's Black Artists in British Art, A History Since the 1950s from 2014.
Within this field, there has been a significant strand of scholarship on photography and related practices, including Noni Stacey's Photography of Protest and Community, The Radical Collectives of the 1970s, which came out in 2020. Ian Borland's Bloodflowers, Rotimi Fani Chiodi, Photography in the 1980s from 2019. Mark Seeley's Decolonizing the Camera, Photography in Racial Time, also from 2019. Nama Klorman Iraqi's The Visual is Political, Feminist Photography and Countercultural Activity in 1970s Britain, also from 2019, as well as Jill Park's work for and on the feminist photography organisation Pavilion in Leeds, Deborah Cherry's catalogue for Maud Salter, Passion at Street Level Photo Works in 2015, and Laura Guy's writing on lesbian photography in Aperture and Photo Works, also from 2015.
Recent exhibitions include Still I Rise in its various iterations at Nottingham Contemporary, Delaware Pavilion and Arnolfili in Bristol, Sunil Gupta's major retrospective at the Photographers Gallery in London, Claudette Johnson at Modern Art Oxford, Sonia Boyce at Manchester Art Gallery, as well as the important Speech Acts, Reflection, Imagination, Repetition exhibition, also at Manchester, which grew out of the Black Artists and Modernism, or BAM, project led by Boyce.
Not forgetting Laura Guy and Mason Leva Yap's Deep Down Body Thirst at Glasgow International 2018, and Hot Moment at Torto Italia in London in 2019, which they organised under the collective moniker Radcliffe Hall, and GLF at 50, The Art of Protest, curated by Dan de la Motte for Platform Southwark last summer. We are also looking forward over this summer to thinking about the questions raised by Grassroots in relation to exhibitions of Veronica Ryan at Spike Island, Ingrid Pollard at Glasgow Women's Library, Shruta Biswas at Kettle's Yard and Baltic Gateshead, as well as continuing into 2022 thinking with Tate's retrospective of Labaina Hamid and Boyce's British Pavilion at Venice.
None of this contemporary work would be possible without the foundational scholarship, writing, and activities of grassroots organisers themselves. Crucial publications by Lisa Tickner, Rosika Parker, and Griselda Pollock, emerging from their early grassroots group, the Women's Art History Collective, along with Claire Johnston, Laura Mulvey, and Jo Spence, as well as Charting the Journey, edited by Shabnam Grewal, Jackie Kay, Lillian Landor, Gail Lewis, and Pratipa Palmer, laid the coordinates for thinking feminist creative practice, among many others. The work of Simon Watney, Carol Vance, Mandy Merck, and Palmer have been fundamental to thinking through the complexities of sexuality and visual culture in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond.
Hazel Carby's foundational essay, White Women Listen, Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, and his There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, as well as Amal Ghosh and Joginder Lamber's edited volume, Beyond Frontiers, Contemporary British Art by Artists of South Asian Descent, the exhibition and catalogue Transforming the Crown, African, Asian and Caribbean Artists in Britain, 1966 to 1996, and Rasheen Areen's catalogue for the 1989 exhibition The Other Story, Afro-Asian Artists in Post-War Britain, in addition to his collection of writings in Making Myself Visible, have offered the building blocks for thinking about the complex intersections of race, colonialism and culture in relation to the British state, which have in turn informed our thinking for grassroots.
While these authors have all been influential, it was also in contemporaneous periodicals, from the artist-run Feminist Art News to Black Phoenix and Mukti, which Alice Correa will talk about in her contribution to Grassroots, to more established publications like On Our Backs, 10/8, Spare Rib, Third Text, and Time Out, where ideas were debated and actions recorded. For Victoria Horn, who will speak on magazines and the women's liberation movement on the third afternoon in this series, periodicals provided space for artists to connect and arguably defined how feminist art looked.
We are interested in continuing the work of tracing the physical and conceptual journeys, willed and forced, of practitioners and art workers. These processes have also, as we seek to investigate here, fundamentally formed the construction of various counter-hegemonic organizations, which have in their own lifetimes taken on a variety of forms, from the determinedly oppositionality to the strategically aligned. They are traced in papers such as Taus Damani's account of Autograph APB, Association of Black Photographers, which shows how the organization has operated in turn as an association, an agency, an archive, a research center, a publishing house, and an exhibition space. To tell the story of Autograph APB, Damani writes, is to tell the story of its evolution, that of a militant space having become a cultural institution.
This illuminates the necessarily expanded conceptualization of the grassroots that runs through the papers brought together here, in which grassroots organizing is not a static, reified state, but informs the creation of multiple different infrastructures, from AIDS activist video through to, for example, the formation of the Artists Union, both topics which form the focus of papers gathered together in this series.
While the term grassroots might bring to mind connotations of locality, it is important to understand that locality in the context traversed by this event series is inherently transnational, whether that is the organizing structures put in place by the Caribbean arts movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as addressed by Mariam Ohadi Hamdani's paper on Day One, or the creation of the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common through a global network of peace activism, discussed by Alexandra Kokoli in her paper on Day 3. The papers gathered here look at alternative networks of care and support, particularly in connection with the AIDS epidemic, and at the creation of structures for distribution and circulation, from video banks to magazines and journals to slide libraries, all well beyond the academy.
We invoke the term grassroots here as a site of connectivity and relationality, which can hold multiple possibilities in play, and which, even when it occurs within a given system, prompts us to continually think otherwise. It is a term that allows us, we hope, to think about art as a constitutive part of this process, interwoven with, but never subordinated to, questions, for example, of health, of housing, and of education. As Lola Olufemi poses in her abstract for her paper on Black feminist organizations, such as the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent, the Brixton Black Women's Group, and the Black Art Group, quote, grassroots political organizing is a form of creative practice, and when read as such, it reveals the workings of the imagination as a tool that seeks to erode oppressive organizations of social life. This expanded conceptualization of the grassroots is also temporal, as Elizabeth Robles has suggested through her complication of the notion of waves as a way of modeling art history, a project that Robles began as part of an important special issue in 2019 of Nakar, Journal of Contemporary African Art, on new directions in Black British history, edited by Eddie Chambers, and which she will continue to think through as part of the Grassroots series. In her paper on the close of the first day, Anjali Dalal Clayton also provides us with some valuable coordinates for mapping how the energies of these decades continue to shape artist organizing and networking into our present moment.
In refocusing on the grassroots and also seeking to complicate and unravel what the grassroots might mean as a methodological model, we are thinking about the possibilities from an art history from below, one interested in multiplicities and in struggle, but also importantly in tracing the impact of these practices on histories of art making, rather than only acknowledging the presence of such practices and the experiences of the artists involved. In this, we take an example from History from Below, a tendency which emerged from the New Left in the 1970s through key figures including Raphael Samuel and Joan Wallach Scott. While previous historical methodologies may have narrated the experiences of those outside the ruling classes, History from Below described the power of the working class and the disenfranchised to make history. Has the same distinction come to pass in the disciplines of art history, film studies, and photography studies where we find ourselves? Have we applied existing models, such as Parker and Pollock's Old Mistresses, to our own period? Do we credit practices that have been excluded from institutions with the power to make history beyond canon critique or expansion? What new models do we need?
Perhaps one response to these questions may be found in the work of Stuart Hall and the research that emerged out of the Centre for Cultural Studies. In 1983, Hall dated the origins of cultural studies in the UK to the 1950s and 60s, when new tools were needed to understand the, quote, subtle and often contradictory cultural change, end quote, ushered in during the post-war period. Hall argued, quote, that if you can understand the changes that are taking place in the culture of a society, you will have a very important strategic clue to understanding broader change in society's nature and how it is working. For Hall, cultural studies was a political rather than an intellectual project, a means to understand a complex field of symbolism, of synthesis, and of differentiation. If cultural studies allows us to think across media, genre, and form, about consciousness across the boundaries and barriers of class and value otherwise instituted, then it has had less impact on the material form of those institutions. Major museums, galleries, cinemas, record labels, journals, publishing houses have remained stubbornly disciplinary, increasingly wedded to the market and specialized to the point of self-reflexivity. While we can think the culture of the late 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, we struggle to historicize it intellectually or materially.
Many of the practices we will hear about in the next few sessions corresponded or even responded to Hall's political project, inventing new cultural forms in spite of or antagonistic to the elite hegemony. The practices of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s prove the point of cultural studies in overturning the idea that, quote, that economic relations sets or establishes the terms and limits within which the superstructure operates, as Hall said. Power does not determine culture, it merely dominates the telling. And it's from this spirit of narrating histories differently that Grassroots emerges.
We have emerged the papers that will be shared and discussed over the 3 Grassroots sessions on Thursdays, the 29th of April, 13th of May and 3rd of June, respectively, into a series of sub-themes. On the first day, we have grouped together a set of papers under the headings Operable Infrastructures, which is panel 1, and Collective Organising, which is panel 2. On the second day, we will have 2 panels with sets of papers that each address work and activism, it's panel 3, and health and therapy, panel 4, respectively. The third and final section brings together papers on the themes of confrontations in panel 5 and production, circulation and distribution in panel 6. These themes emerged from the paper proposals we received from an open call for papers and are organised to open up connections between moments and milieus. In doing so, we want to establish points of similarity and divergence, to bring histories, creative practices, and politics, as well as the different methodologies of our speakers, into rare proximity.
Thank you for joining us over the 3 sessions, and please remember to check back to the website to watch any recordings of anything you've missed. Thank you.